On screen, Bobby Wheeler was Taxi's vain, ambitious star-in-waiting. Off-screen, a terrifying reality was tearing a man apart. This is Taxi's Jeff Conaway, how drugs and Hollywood destroyed his life. The tragedy lies in the brutal contrast. While millions cheered for a character chasing a bright future, Jeff Conaway was actively drowning in a lethal abyss of cocaine and heavy opiates. He played a dreamer desperate to escape his circumstances. Yet between takes, he was frequently found unconscious in his dressing room, locking himself inside a permanent chemical prison. And when that addiction finally shattered him, the Hollywood machine didn't stop to save his life. They simply weighed his usefulness and quietly threw him away. This image was incredibly easy to believe. In 1978, the man playing Bobby Wheeler was already a sensation. He was Jeff Conaway. The world knew him as Kenickie from the cinematic juggernaut Grease. He was the effortlessly cool, tough-talking rebel singing Greased Lightning. He had the classic, chiseled looks of a leading man and possessed a natural, magnetic stage presence. When Jeff Conaway walked onto the set of Taxi, he carried the legitimate aura of a star on the verge of a massive breakthrough. But the camera only captures a carefully constructed illusion. Behind the scenes, a very different reality was taking hold. The man playing the ambitious dreamer was rapidly sinking into an abyss. He was locked in a private, escalating war with cocaine, alcohol, and prescription painkillers. While Bobby Wheeler was confidently predicting his name in lights, Jeff Conaway was physically collapsing. He was often found incapacitated in his dressing room, too high to perform his duties. When a star begins to break down, the entertainment machine does not stop to heal them. It simply measures their remaining utility. The producers looked at a struggling man and quietly decided he was expendable. Hollywood was perfectly willing to replace him without a second thought. This is the tragic paradox of Jeff Conaway, a man who portrayed a character desperate to escape his circumstances while actively building a real-world prison from which he would never break free. In the late 1970s, American television was saturated with cheerful, idealized families. Taxi fundamentally shifted that paradigm. It was not a sitcom about success. It was an exploration of working-class purgatory set in a grimy, exhaust-choked Manhattan garage. The creators mined genuine pathos from human failure, crafting a concrete trap for individuals who had slipped through the cracks of the American dream. Overlooking the stained walls and fluorescent lights was a literal wire cage. Inside sat the dispatcher, Louis De Palma, played with tyrannical brilliance by Danny DeVito. He was the warden, constantly reminding his drivers they were at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The ensemble cast, featuring Judd Hirsch, Christopher Lloyd, and Andy Kaufman, was a masterclass in varied forms of failure. They played burnt-out casualties, untalented dreamers, and deeply cynical men bound together by a shared sense of denial. Almost no one in the garage actually identified as a cab driver. It was merely a stopgap measure while they waited for their real lives to begin. Into this miserable, brilliantly constructed ecosystem walked Bobby Wheeler. Played by Jeff Conaway, Bobby was the visual and narrative outlier of the group. While the others looked tired and beaten down by the city, Bobby was striking, energetic, and immaculately groomed. He was the resident, aspiring actor. To Bobby Wheeler, the Sunshine Cab Company was just an inconvenient waiting room before he took his rightful place on the silver screen. He refused to wear his driver's uniform properly, often sporting fashionable clothes beneath an unbuttoned shirt. He carried his professional headshots to the garage like a shield against the grime around him. The comedy of Bobby Wheeler derived entirely from his relentless vanity colliding with the harsh, undeniable reality of his environment. He was deeply arrogant, yet constantly humiliated by the industry he worshipped. He would eagerly brag to his fellow drivers about a humiliating audition for a minor commercial product, completely convinced that playing a singing vegetable was his stepping stone to working with Martin Scorsese. He possessed a desperate, hollow confidence. Louis De Palma constantly targeted Bobby, ruthlessly mocking his acting abilities and reminding him that his good looks were slowly fading while he sat behind the wheel of a yellow Ford. This dynamic created a biting, often painful irony on screen. Taxi was a masterpiece precisely because it confronted failure head-on. It was a show that asked a very uncomfortable question. What happens to a person when their deeply held dream simply never comes true? Bobby Wheeler was designed by the writers to be the punchline to that very question. He was the handsome fool who could not see that the cab garage was not a temporary stepping stone, but quite possibly his final destination. He was the embodiment of the Hollywood delusion, the guy desperately trying to climb out of an inescapable pit. But the most profound, unsettling tragedy was occurring entirely off camera. The audience at home laughed at Bobby Wheeler's failed auditions and arrogant missteps, viewing him as a lovable loser. Yet the man bringing him to life was supposed to be the antithesis of that narrative. Jeff Conaway was a legitimate rising star who had already tasted the global success that his character was begging for. He possessed the talent, the resume, and the undeniable charisma that should have secured him a permanent place at the top of the entertainment industry. The lines between the cynical sitcom and a dark, living reality began to blur in a horrifying manner. Taxi was fundamentally a narrative about disposable people, satirizing the way the world grinds down ambition. As Jeff Conaway's personal demons silently took control, he started to mirror the very failure his character was written to mock. He was standing on a soundstage delivering lines about an unrecognized actor, while quietly living the exact tragedy the show was trying to satirize. The Sunshine Cab Company garage was supposed to be a purely fictional, temporary stop for Bobby Wheeler. But for Jeff Conaway, the unyielding reality of substance abuse was actively destroying his potential, guaranteeing that no Hollywood audition could ever rescue him. The year 1978 did not simply happen to Jeff Conaway. He seized it with the unapologetic ambition of a man who believed the world was entirely his for the taking. He was not a sudden accidental star created by a studio marketing department. He was a working actor who had spent years grinding through the grueling, unsentimental machinery of the New York theatrical world, waiting for the precise moment to kick the door down. When that moment finally arrived, he possessed a swagger that could not be faked. It was the arrogance of a man who had gambled his entire life on his own talent and won. Born in New York City in 1950, Conaway was immersed in the harsh, unsentimental realities of the entertainment industry from childhood. He survived the relentless rejection of child acting to become a formidable, physically imposing stage actor by the early 1970s. His raw grit earned him a spot in the original Broadway production of Grease, where he eventually took over the lead role of Danny Zuko from Richard Gere. He had proven he could carry a massive production on his own shoulders, cementing a profound, unshakable confidence that he was a leading man destined for superstardom. That validation arrived in the form of a plane ticket to Los Angeles. Hollywood had decided to adapt Grease into a major motion picture. The studio system, however, operates on a rigid, unforgiving hierarchy. Despite his Broadway pedigree, Conaway was not handed the lead role of Danny Zuko for the film. That part was given to John Travolta, who was already riding an unprecedented wave of global superstardom following his television success on Welcome Back, Kotter, and the cultural earthquake of Saturday Night Fever. Conaway was instead cast in the supporting role of Kanaki, Zuko's tough, abrasive, and fiercely loyal best friend. While Hollywood's adaptation of Grease brought validation, it also delivered a brutal lesson in ego-driven power dynamics. Conaway poured all his ambition into playing Kaneki, approaching the role not as a sidekick, but as a co-lead in exile. However, according to numerous accounts, John Travolta utilized his massive star leverage to take the lead vocals on Greased Lightnin', the iconic song that traditionally belonged to Kaneki in the stage musical. Conaway was relegated to dancing backup on the hood of a car his own character owned. It was a bitter professional humiliation that forced him to swallow his anger and execute the choreography flawlessly. But that lingering resentment pushed him to perform with an intense, aggressive physical energy. It was during the filming of this exact musical sequence that the physical seed of his eventual destruction was planted. During a complex dance maneuver for the Greased Lightnin' number, Conaway was supposed to be caught by his fellow cast members. They slipped. Conaway fell awkwardly, suffering a severe and intensely painful back injury. In the modern era of film production, an injury of this magnitude would likely halt production and trigger immediate medical intervention. But in 1978, the Hollywood machine simply could not afford to stop. The schedule was tight, the budget was locked, and the show had to go on. To keep him on his feet and in front of the cameras, doctors prescribed Conaway heavy narcotic painkillers. At the time, the medical community and the entertainment industry possessed a dangerously cavalier attitude toward prescription opiates. They were viewed as a necessary tool to maintain productivity, a simple chemical solution to a physical obstacle. For Conaway, the pills were a revelation. They did not just numb the agonizing pain in his spine. They smoothed out the rough edges of his anxiety. They quieted the burning resentment over his stolen solo. They made the grueling, high-pressure environment of a major studio film set feel manageable, even enjoyable. It was a seemingly harmless medical intervention that secretly opened a door in his brain, a door that he would never be able to close. When Grease premiered in the summer of 1978, it did not merely open, it exploded. It became a monumental cultural phenomenon, completely dominating the global box office and eventually grossing nearly $400 million worldwide. The soundtrack became omnipresent. The cast became overnight royalty. For Jeff Conaway, the transition was blinding. He went from being a respected working Broadway actor to an international heartthrob in a matter of weeks. His face was plastered across teen magazines globally. He could not walk down a street in Los Angeles without being mobbed. He was attending exclusive parties, surrounded by immense wealth, beautiful people, and the intoxicating, dangerous excess of late 1970s Hollywood culture. He had finally achieved the absolute peak of the mountain he had been climbing since he was 10 years old. The money, the fame, the validation, it was all there. He felt invincible. He felt that the years of rejection, the grueling stage work, and the bitter Hollywood politics had finally paid off. He was a newly minted movie star, radiating an aura of total, unshakable success. It was exactly at this precise moment of maximum altitude that the producers of a new television pilot called Taxi were looking for their Bobby Wheeler. The character they had written on the page was a struggling, overly confident, aspiring actor who drove a cab while waiting for his big break. They needed someone who could embody blind vanity and aggressive ambition. When Jeff Conaway walked into the audition room, he did not even need to act. He simply brought his current reality into the room. He walked in wearing the invisible crown of a man who had just conquered the global box office. He possessed the exact swagger of Kenickie, refined by the massive paychecks and the magazine covers. The producers took one look at him and realized they had found lightning in a bottle. Conaway was perfectly cast because he brought a terrifying authenticity to the arrogance of Bobby Wheeler. When Bobby Wheeler stood in the Sunshine Cab garage, looking down his nose at the other drivers, it was funny because the audience knew Bobby was a failure. But Conaway played him with the fierce absolute conviction of a man who knew he was a massive star. The physical choices he made, the perfect posture, the meticulously styled hair, the dismissive wave of a hand, the way he constantly checked his reflection in the grimy garage mirrors. These were not the actions of a man pretending to be confident. They were the actions of a man who believed the entire world was currently revolving around him. In 1978, Jeff Conaway was the handsome young man who had just stepped out of Kenickie's leather jacket and directly into television history. He entered the set of Taxi as a conqueror. He was Bobby Wheeler brought to life, fully convinced that his current level of fame was merely the prologue to an even greater legacy. He was untouchable. He was brilliant. He was at the absolute dizzying zenith of his professional existence. But the most dangerous aspect of standing at the very top of the world is that you cannot see the rot beneath your own feet. As he smiled for the cameras and delivered his lines with perfect comedic timing, the pain in his back remained a constant throbbing companion. The prescription bottles in his dressing room were slowly becoming an essential part of his daily routine. The cocaine that flowed freely through the Hollywood party circuit was moving from a weekend indulgence to a daily requirement. The arrogance he projected on screen was rapidly becoming a defensive shield, a way to mask the creeping silent dependency that was taking root in his nervous system. He was the golden boy of network television, looking boldly into a limitless future, completely unaware that the countdown to his own destruction had already begun. The transition from functional indulgence to crippling dependency is rarely a sudden collapse. It is a slow, insidious creep. For Jeff Conaway, the first season of Taxi was a triumph of adrenaline and residual momentum from his cinematic success. He was holding the pieces together. But as the show rolled into its second season in late 1979, the exhausting reality of network television production began to grind against his rapidly deteriorating physical and mental state. Network sitcoms in the late 1970s operated like high-pressure factories. The schedule was relentless. Mondays were for table reads. Tuesdays and Wednesdays involved grueling blocking and rehearsals on the soundstage. Thursdays brought camera blocking. Fridays were tape nights, performed in front of a live studio audience. It was a machine that demanded absolute precision, punctuality, and focus from every single cog in the wheel. If one actor dropped a line, missed a mark, or lost their rhythm, the entire multi-camera setup stalled. Time was quite literally money. Conaway was attempting to feed this machine while his own internal wiring was completely short-circuiting. The painkillers he had been prescribed for his brutal back injury on the set of Grease had altered his baseline chemistry. To counter the lethargy induced by the heavy opiates, he increasingly turned to cocaine. In the Hollywood of 1979, cocaine was ubiquitous. It was casually passed around at parties, kept in desk drawers by executives, and viewed by many actors as a necessary stimulant to survive 18-hour workdays. But for Conaway, it was not a recreational boost. It was a desperate chemical attempt to stabilize a body that was in constant, agonizing pain. He was trapped in a vicious biochemical crossfire. He took opiates to numb the physical trauma in his spine, which dragged him into a sedated fog. He then snorted cocaine to shock his nervous system back into a state of hyper-alertness so he could stand under the hot studio lights and deliver Bobby Wheeler's rapid-fire comedic dialogue. This toxic pendulum swing began to tear his central nervous system apart. The signs of his unraveling quickly became impossible to ignore. Initially, it was just chronic tardiness. Conaway would arrive late for the Monday table reads, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, sweating profusely in the air-conditioned rehearsal rooms. The sharp, vibrant energy he had brought to the pilot episode was being replaced by a frantic, brittle edge. Then came the behavioral explosions. The cast of Taxi was a tightly knit, highly professional ensemble of seasoned theater veterans. Judd Hirsch and Danny DeVito were men who treated the script with immense respect. Conaway, increasingly erratic, began to disrupt this professional ecosystem. He started skipping crucial blocking rehearsals entirely. When confronted by directors or producers, he would launch into screaming, volatile fits of rage. He was defensive, paranoid, and fiercely protective of his crumbling facade. He operated under the delusion that his status as a breakout movie star granted him immunity from the basic rules of workplace conduct. By the middle of the second season, the secret was completely out. Every grip, every lighting technician, and every script supervisor on stage 25 at the Paramount lot knew exactly what was wrong with the actor playing Bobby Wheeler. They watched him transform from a confident leading man into a liability. They saw the physical tremors in his hands when he tried to hold a prop coffee cup. They noticed the way his castmates had to physically guide him to his tape marks on the floor because his spatial awareness was entirely gone. Yet, the camera possesses a terrifying ability to lie. When the red light blinked on, Conaway could still occasionally summon the ghost of his former brilliance. He would force his spine straight, flash that $1 million Kinnicky smile, and perfectly execute Bobby Wheeler's signature arrogance. On television screens across America, Bobby Wheeler remained the handsome, ambitious young man waiting for his ship to come in. The audience saw a character brimming with potential, but the crew standing behind the camera saw a man actively drowning. The breaking point, the moment the industry cold-bloodedly calculated his exact worth, arrived during the production of an episode written by a young, newly hired staff writer named Sam Simon. Simon, who would later achieve legendary status as the co-creator of The Simpsons, was facing the immense pressure of his first script going to tape. It was a Friday night. The studio audience was seated in the bleachers. The cameras were warmed up. The floor manager was calling for places. Judd Hirsch was at his mark. Tony Danza was in the cab. But Jeff Conaway was nowhere to be found. Production ground to a complete agonizing halt. Assistants were dispatched frantically across the Paramount lot. They checked the commissary, the parking lot, the soundstage corridors. Finally, someone opened the door to Conaway's private dressing room. The sight inside stripped away the last remaining illusions of Hollywood glamour. The man who had commanded the global box office a year prior was slumped over, completely incapacitated. He was so heavily sedated by a cocktail of narcotics that he could not be roused. He was completely unresponsive. He was not just unprepared to act, he was fundamentally incapable of basic motor functions. The news was rushed back to the producer standing on the studio floor. In a normal workplace, discovering an employee in an unconscious drug-induced state would trigger immediate medical intervention and a total shutdown of operations. Paramedics would be called. But network television is not a normal workplace. The studio audience was getting restless. The network executives were waiting for the tapes. What happened next is a chilling masterclass in Hollywood ruthlessness. There was no panic. There was no grand emotional crisis about the health of their star. Instead, the producers and writers engaged in a rapid clinical exercise in crisis management. Sam Simon watched as the showrunners simply took a pen to his script. They looked at the dialogue assigned to Bobby Wheeler for that scene. They did not rewrite the scene. They did not cancel the shoot. They merely crossed out the name Bobby and reassigned the lines. They handed half of Conaway's jokes to Danny DeVito. They handed the other half to Christopher Lloyd. The floor manager called action. DeVito and Lloyd stepped into the scene and delivered the dialogue flawlessly. The studio audience laughed exactly when they were supposed to laugh. The scene worked perfectly. The cameras kept rolling. The machine kept moving forward, entirely unbothered by the fact that one of its primary gears was currently unconscious in a dark room a few hundred feet away. That specific tape night fundamentally altered the trajectory of Jeff Conaway's life, even though he was not awake to witness it. When the producers sat in the editing bay the following week and reviewed the footage, they experienced a cold, undeniable epiphany. They watched a scene that was supposed to feature Bobby Wheeler. Bobby Wheeler was missing, but the jokes still landed. The narrative still advanced. The dynamic of the Sunshine Cab Company remained entirely intact. They realized with absolute clarity that the show did not actually need him to survive. This is the most dangerous moment for any actor in the entertainment industry. It is not the moment you get a bad review. It is not the moment you demand too much money. It is the moment the people writing the checks realize that your absence does not hurt the product. Jeff Conaway had become the living embodiment of the word expendable. The tragic irony of this realization is staggering when placed against the narrative of the show itself. Taxi was a show about people desperate to be noticed, people terrified of being forgotten by the world. Bobby Wheeler was the loudest voice in that garage, constantly demanding attention, constantly asserting his own immense value to anyone who would listen. He was a character built entirely on the premise of his own indispensability. But as Bobby Wheeler yelled about his future on screen, the men in the production booth were quietly charting Jeff Conaway's exit. They did not call a press conference to announce his substance abuse. They did not fire him in a dramatic confrontation on the studio floor. The Hollywood machine operates with much more efficiency than that. They simply stopped viewing him as an asset and started managing him as a liability. The scripts began to subtly shift. Bobby Wheeler's presence in the ensemble was quietly reduced. His storylines became less central to the emotional core of the episodes. The writers began to instinctively protect the show from Conaway's unreliability by ensuring that no critical narrative weight rested solely on his shoulders. If he showed up and hit his marks, it was a bonus. If he vanished into his dressing room again, they knew exactly how to divide his lines and keep the cameras rolling. Jeff Conaway had walked onto the set of Taxi as a conquering hero. He was the golden boy, the breakout star, the man who held all the leverage. But addiction is the great equalizer. It stripped him of his professionalism. Then it stripped him of his reliability. And finally, it stripped him of his power. He was now just a problem to be managed. The producers had looked into the abyss of his addiction, and their only reaction was to figure out how to shoot around it. By the time the production of Taxi entered its third season, in the latter half of 1980, a profound and chilling silence had descended around Jeff Conaway. It was not a literal silence on the bustling Paramount sound stages, but rather the distinct isolating silence that an industry reserves for those it has decided to abandon. The show itself was an absolute juggernaut. It was sweeping the Emmy Awards, dominating the cultural conversation, and turning its ensemble cast into undisputed television royalty. Judd Hirsch was being celebrated for his grounded brilliance. Danny DeVito was exploding into a household name, transforming Louis De Palma into an iconic figure of American comedy. The Sunshine Cab Company was the most famous garage in the world, but the man who had walked into that garage as its biggest, most bankable movie star was now living on an island of his own making, entirely cut off from the collective triumph happening all around him. Hollywood rarely removes a problematic element through direct confrontation. A multi-million-dollar television production is a corporate machine, and corporate machines do not act out of malice. They act out of a cold instinct for self-preservation. Following the undeniable realization that Conaway was an active liability, cemented by the incident where his dialogue was unceremoniously redistributed while he lay incapacitated, the entire ecosystem of the set fundamentally changed its relationship with him. The director stopped pushing him for better takes. If Conaway stumbled through a scene, slightly glassy-eyed, but managing to hit his tape mark, the director would simply call cut and print the take. They stopped treating him like an artist who needed direction and started treating him like a fragile, explosive device that needed to be handled with extreme caution. The crew members, the lighting technicians, and the makeup artists maintained a polite, impenetrable professional distance. There were no more casual jokes between takes. There was only the tense, unspoken objective of getting the actor through his scenes before his chemical equilibrium collapsed entirely. This professional quarantine extended directly into the writer's room. Television writers are fundamentally problem solvers, and Jeff Conaway had become the most expensive problem on the lot. They could no longer trust him to carry the emotional weight of a complex storyline. If they wrote a pivotal, deeply poignant episode centering on Bobby Wheeler, they ran the terrifying risk of Conaway not showing up on tape night, which would force them to scrap an entire week of production. To mitigate this financial and logistical risk, the writers initiated a subtle, systematic reduction of his character. Bobby Wheeler's presence in the scripts began to shrink. He was stripped of the nuance that Conaway had originally brought to the role. Instead of exploring the genuine pathos of a failing actor, Bobby was increasingly reduced to a one-dimensional punchline. He would walk into the garage, deliver a vain remark about his hair, stare blankly into a mirror, and exit the scene. The heavy lifting, the moments of dramatic tension and true comedic brilliance, was aggressively shifted onto the shoulders of Hirsch, DeVito, and Christopher Lloyd. The writers were quietly building a wall around the character of Bobby Wheeler, effectively soundproofing the show from the chaos of Jeff Conaway's personal life. The psychological toll this takes on an actor is devastating, yet the mind of an addict possesses a terrifying ability to distort reality to protect the ego. Conaway was acutely aware that his role was diminishing. He could feel the temperature dropping on the set. He could count the lines he was being assigned and see the disparity. But instead of looking inward at the cocaine, the alcohol, and the heavy painkillers that were destroying his reliability, his ego built a massive defensive fortress. He convinced himself that the problem was not his addiction, but a lack of creative vision from the production team. He began to loudly complain that he was being stifled. He adopted the posture of a misunderstood cinematic genius who was being unjustly held back by the limitations of network television. In his chemically altered perception, he was not a liability being managed by terrified producers. He was a thoroughbred racehorse being forced to pull a plow. He convinced himself that he was outgrowing the show, entirely blind to the tragic reality that the show had already outgrown him. This cognitive dissonance provided the producers with the perfect frictionless opportunity to execute his removal. By the conclusion of the third season in 1981, the decision had been finalized in the executive offices. Jeff Conaway was not going to be invited back, but a public firing would generate messy tabloid headlines and potentially damage the pristine brand of the network's most prestigious comedy. They needed an elegant, narratively satisfying exit strategy. The writers looked at the core premise of Bobby Wheeler, a man desperately waiting for a call from Hollywood, and realized that the easiest way to remove the actor was to finally give the character exactly what he wanted. They wrote a storyline that was a masterpiece of meta-narrative convenience. In the fiction of the show, the impossible finally happens. Bobby Wheeler receives a phone call from the West Coast. He has been offered a legitimate acting opportunity, a pilot that could launch him into actual stardom. After years of posturing, lying, and suffering the relentless mockery of Louis De Palma, Bobby Wheeler packs his bags and leaves the misery of the New York taxi garage behind him. It was a triumphant, hopeful farewell for the character. The audience watched Bobby walk out the door to chase his destiny, cheering for the arrogant but lovable loser who had finally caught a break. The contrast between the fictional triumph of Bobby Wheeler and the grim reality of Jeff Conaway is arguably one of the most painful ironies in television history. When the camera stopped rolling on that final scene, there was no grand confrontation. There was no formal disciplinary meeting in an executive boardroom where a stern producer listed his offenses. The season simply wrapped. The cast and crew went home for the summer hiatus, and when the contracts were drawn up for the fourth season, Jeff Conaway's name was simply omitted. The phone stopped ringing. The security guard at the Paramount gate stopped waving him through. He had not been dramatically fired. He had simply been erased. The Hollywood machine had calculated that the effort required to save him vastly outweighed the value he brought to the screen. For years after his silent dismissal, Conaway clung fiercely to his fabricated reality. He refused to allow the narrative of addiction to define his exit from the pinnacle of his career. Nearly a decade later, during an extensive interview with the Toronto Star in 1989, he was pressed about his sudden departure from a show that was making television history. He looked the journalist in the eye and delivered a masterclass in denial. He claimed that he walked away voluntarily because the character of Bobby Wheeler had become creatively stagnant. He argued that the writers were repeating themselves, that the role was completely underused, and that remaining on the show would have been detrimental to his artistic growth as a serious actor. He framed his exit as a courageous, independent stand for creative integrity. It was a necessary, desperate lie. To admit the truth in 1989 would have required Conaway to look in the mirror and acknowledge that his own demons had cost him the greatest, most secure job he would ever hold. It would require him to admit that he had squandered a golden ticket. He maintained the illusion that he had abandoned the Sunshine Cab Company on his own terms, preserving the fragile remnants of his pride, while his career outside of the show continued to quietly disintegrate. Industry insiders, his former castmates, and the executives who had quietly shown him the door all knew the absolute truth. They allowed him to tell his story to the newspapers because ultimately, Hollywood does not care about the lies an expendable actor tells to comfort himself in the dark. They did not need to fire Jeff Conaway. They only needed to recognize that he could be replaced without the audience noticing a drop in quality. That is the most bitter, unyielding lesson of the entertainment industry. Bobby Wheeler was granted the dignity of leaving that claustrophobic taxi garage to confidently pursue his ultimate dream. But Jeff Conaway was never granted that same opportunity because he had already forfeited his future. He had systematically dismantled his own career, pill by pill, line by line, long before the writers ever typed the final fade to black on his character. When an actor of Jeff Conaway's profile is quietly ejected from the Hollywood machinery, there is no loud, dramatic crash. There is only a deafening, terrifying silence. In the immediate aftermath of his departure from Taxi in 1981, Conaway awoke to a reality that his ego simply could not process. The frantic energy that had defined his life for the past 4 years vanished overnight. There were no more 5 a.m. call times. There were no more makeup trailers. There were no more studio audiences waiting to validate his existence with their laughter. He was 31 years old. He had convinced himself that leaving the sitcom would open the floodgates for a massive film career, a return to the glorious trajectory he had charted after Grease. He waited in his Los Angeles home for the telephone to ring. He waited for Steven Spielberg. He waited for Martin Scorsese. He waited for the scripts that would prove he was a generational talent. The telephone did not ring. The entertainment industry is exceptionally small and brutally communicative. The executives running the major studios did not view Conaway as an uncompromising artist who had bravely walked away from a creatively stifling television role. They viewed him as a massive liability. They knew exactly why he was no longer driving a cab on Paramount Stage 25. They knew about the cocaine. They knew about the explosive temper tantrums. They knew about the days he had been found unconscious in his dressing room. In a business where millions of dollars ride on an actor's ability to simply show up and hit a tape mark, a reputation for chemical unreliability is a permanent death sentence. The A-list directors he thought he was destined to work with simply crossed his name off their casting sheets. He was effectively blacklisted, not for his politics or his lack of talent, but because he was a bad investment. As the 1980s progressed, the financial reality of his situation began to violently dismantle his pride. The residual checks from Grease and Taxi provided a financial cushion, but a lifestyle built on heavy narcotic consumption and Hollywood excess burns through cash with terrifying speed. Conaway was forced to confront the indignity of a fading star. He had to fire his top-tier representation and sign with agents who handled the lower rungs of the industry. He found himself walking into sterile audition rooms for network guest spots, reading for parts that were a fraction of the size of Bobby Wheeler. He appeared in single episodes of Murder, She Wrote, Matlock, and Mike Hammer. He took roles in low-budget, direct-to-video B-movies. For a man who had once stood toe-to-toe with John Travolta in the biggest movie on the planet, this descent was psychological torture. Every minor guest role was a stinging reminder of what he had squandered. He was no longer the main attraction. He was a recognizable face hired for a single week of work to boost the ratings of someone else's television show. To cope with this crushing daily humiliation, Conaway retreated further into the only mechanism that offered him absolute relief. The cocaine replaced the adrenaline of a live studio audience. The prescription opiates numbed the bitter, gnawing resentment of a stalled career. He was trapped in a self-reinforcing cycle of despair. His career was failing because of his addiction, and his addiction was accelerating because his career was failing. He spent over a decade wandering through this professional wasteland before he was thrown a temporary lifeline. In 1989, he managed to secure a recurring role on the soap opera The Bold and the Beautiful. It was steady work, but the punishing, relentless schedule of daytime television was physically grueling, and he departed the show after just a year. He was slipping back into obscurity when, in 1994, he was offered the role of Zach Allen in the ambitious syndicated science fiction series Babylon 5. For Conaway, Babylon 5 represented a desperate chance at redemption. The character of Zach Allen was a security officer on a massive space station. He was a working-class guy, a man who followed orders and tried to maintain order in a chaotic environment. There was a profound, almost tragic irony in the casting. The producers had hired a man whose personal life was an absolute unstructured disaster to play a character defined entirely by discipline and law enforcement. But Conaway grasped the opportunity with both hands. He needed the steady paycheck. He needed the structure of a daily call sheet to force him out of bed. During his 4 years on Babylon 5, the audience witnessed a stark physical transformation. The Jeff Conaway who appeared on screen as Zach Allen was fundamentally different from the Jeff Conaway who had played Kenickie or Bobby Wheeler. The arrogant, youthful swagger was entirely gone. His face carried the heavy, unmistakable toll of long-term substance abuse. His features were bloated. His eyes lacked their former sharp, predatory spark. He moved with the stiff, careful hesitation of a man who was living in constant, unyielding physical pain. He was no longer a leading man. He was a survivor trying to hold on to the absolute bottom rung of the ladder. Babylon 5 introduced him to the lucrative, entirely distinct ecosystem of the science fiction convention circuit. He began traveling to hotels across the country, sitting behind folding tables, charging fans $20 for an autographed glossy photograph of himself. For a fleeting moment, these conventions offered a strange, hollow echo of his former glory. Fans would approach his table, tell him how much they loved Greece, and look at him with genuine admiration. But when the convention hall emptied and he returned alone to a sterile hotel room in a city he didn't know, the applause evaporated. The convention circuit was not the A-list Hollywood career he had aggressively promised himself. It was a nostalgic graveyard, a place where actors went to monetize their past because they had no viable future. When Babylon 5 concluded its run in 1998, the brief period of stability vanished with it. Conaway was plunged back into the dark. The subsequent decade was a relentless, quiet collapse. The occasional acting jobs completely dried up. His physical condition deteriorated rapidly. The back injury that had originated on the set of Grease 2 decades prior had never properly healed, and the decades of masking the pain with heavy narcotics had ravaged his internal organs. He was living in complete isolation, estranged from the industry, fighting a daily losing battle against his own biochemistry. He had become a ghost in a town that worships youth and punishes failure. In 2008, the entertainment industry found a new, grotesque way to monetize Jeff Conaway. He had no value to them as an actor anymore. No studio would insure him for a film shoot. No network would cast him in a sitcom. But reality television had emerged as a dominant, ruthlessly exploitative force in American culture. Reality television did not require an actor to be sober, professional, or reliable. It only required them to be entertaining. And there is nothing reality television finds more entertaining than the public humiliation of a fallen star. Conaway agreed to participate in the first season of the VH1 reality series Celebrity Rehab with Dr. Drew. It was a decision born of absolute terrifying desperation. He needed the money to survive, and perhaps on some deeply buried level, he recognized that he was going to die if he did not seek radical intervention. When he arrived at the Pasadena Recovery Center to begin filming, the visual impact was shocking. The audience that tuned in, remembering the vibrant, leather-clad Kinnicky, was confronted with a shattered, frail old man. He arrived at the facility in a wheelchair. He was incoherent, sweating profusely, and visibly shaking from severe withdrawal. He could barely form a complete sentence. He brought a massive, terrifying arsenal of prescription medications with him. He freely admitted on camera to a daily regimen of cocaine, heavy alcohol consumption, and a staggering amount of prescription painkillers. The man who had once been the epitome of Hollywood cool was now actively begging for his life on basic cable. The cameras rolled mercilessly as he suffered through the agonizing physical symptoms of detoxification. He writhed in his bed, screaming in pain, lashing out at the nurses and doctors who were attempting to stabilize him. It was not entertainment. It was a televised autopsy of a living human being. But Celebrity Rehab also forced Conaway to confront the psychological demons that had been driving his addiction for over 30 years. In a deeply uncomfortable raw group therapy session broadcast to millions of viewers, the arrogant facade of Bobby Wheeler was finally, permanently stripped away. Conaway broke down and revealed the horrifying origin point of his trauma. He disclosed that he had been the victim of severe child abuse and had been subjected to pedophilia from the age of 7. This revelation changed the entire complexion of his tragedy. Suddenly, the arrogance, the explosive anger, the relentless drive for fame, and the catastrophic drug use all made a terrible, perfect sense. He was not just a spoiled Hollywood actor who partied too hard. He was a profoundly traumatized survivor who had spent his entire life trying to outrun a childhood nightmare. He had sought out the spotlight because he desperately needed the world to validate him, to tell him he had worth. And when he reached the absolute top of the mountain and realized the applause could not erase the trauma in his mind, he had turned to chemicals to silence the noise. Hollywood had taken a broken boy, exploited his talent, cheered for his arrogance, and then unceremoniously discarded him the moment his coping mechanisms made him difficult to work with. They did not care why he was in pain. They only cared that his pain was disrupting their shooting schedule. And now, decades later, they were paying him to broadcast that same pain for ratings. His time in the rehabilitation facility provided a brief period of sobriety, but it was a temporary dam built against an ocean of trauma and physical agony. When the cameras stopped rolling and the reality show concluded, he was sent back out into the world. He was still in chronic physical pain. He was still deeply alone. The underlying issues that had plagued him since childhood had been exposed, but they had not been cured. The final fatal blow was not delivered by a drug cartel or an overdose in a seedy motel room. It was delivered by a simple tragic accident that perfectly illustrated the fragility of his existence. In 2010, at the age of 60, Conaway suffered a catastrophic fall down a staircase in his home. His body, already weakened by decades of abuse, shattered under the impact. He suffered a broken hip, a broken arm, a fractured neck, and a severe brain hemorrhage. The irony was brutally cruel. The exact mechanism that had triggered his addiction in 1978, a traumatic physical injury on a set, had returned to finish the job. He was confined to a bed, completely incapacitated by an unimaginably severe level of pain. The doctors had no choice but to prescribe him massive doses of opiates simply to keep him from going into shock. He was thrown directly back into the chemical fire he had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to extinguish. There was no camera crew to document this final descent. There was no studio audience. There was no Dr. Drew offering therapeutic platitudes. There was only an aging, broken man lying in a dark room, entirely reliant on the very substances that had destroyed his life, just to endure the agonizing passage of a single day. He had fallen from the absolute zenith of global fame into a profound, inescapable freefall. The star of Grease and Taxi had been reduced to a prisoner in his own shattered body, waiting in silence for an industry that had long since forgotten his name to finally write the ending to his tragic script. By the spring of 2011, the physical vessel that housed Jeff Conaway was no longer functioning as a human body. It was operating as a failing chemical containment unit. The final weeks of his life possessed none of the romanticized Hollywood notions of a sudden tragic overdose. The reality of end-stage addiction is not cinematic. It is not a dramatic fade to black. It is a grueling, agonizing process of systemic biological collapse. The catastrophic fall he had suffered down his staircase the previous year had left him practically immobilized. His days were confined to the claustrophobic borders of his Los Angeles home. He was a man trapped in a heavily medicated twilight, reliant on a staggering daily intake of prescription opiates simply to prevent his shattered skeletal structure from sending shock waves of unendurable pain into his brain. His central nervous system had been battered by more than 3 decades of severe abuse. It had forgotten how to regulate itself without artificial intervention. The cocaine had ravaged his cardiovascular system, weakening his heart muscle and compromising his blood flow. The alcohol had scarred his liver, severely diminishing his body's ability to filter out the massive quantities of toxins he was ingesting daily. But it was the opiates, the heavy, suffocating blanket of prescription painkillers, that were orchestrating the final shutdown. Opiates do not merely kill the sensation of pain, they fundamentally depress the respiratory system. They trick the brain into forgetting its most basic involuntary survival mechanisms. They slow the heart rate. They shallow the breathing. They suppress the essential reflexes that keep a human being alive. Jeff Conaway was living on the absolute precipice of respiratory failure every single time he closed his eyes to sleep. The inevitable conclusion arrived on the morning of May 11th, 2011. He was discovered in his home, lying entirely unresponsive. He was not breathing properly. His skin was cyanotic, tinged with the unmistakable blue and gray hues of profound oxygen deprivation. He was immediately rushed by ambulance to the Encino Hospital Medical Center in the San Fernando Valley. Within hours, the news leaked to the tabloid press, and the Hollywood media machine reflexively sprang into action. The headlines that flashed across the internet and television screens were predictably sensationalized and entirely stripped of nuance. They reported a massive overdose. They speculated about a suicide attempt. They painted a picture of a desperate, final act of self-destruction by a washed-up celebrity. The public narrative instantly categorized it as a sudden acute event, a man taking a handful of pills in a moment of acute despair. But inside the sterile, terrifyingly quiet confines of the intensive care unit, the critical care physicians attending to Conaway knew the grim truth. This was not a suicide attempt. It was not a singular dramatic mistake. It was the biological bill finally coming due. When they admitted him to the emergency room, they did not just find opiates in his system. They found a body that was actively dying on multiple concurrent fronts. His condition was so profoundly critical that the medical staff immediately placed him into a chemically induced coma. They intubated him, forcing a plastic tube down his trachea and attaching him to a mechanical ventilator. To perform the work his lungs were no longer capable of executing, the clinical diagnosis delivered to his family was a terrifying triad of terminal conditions. He was suffering from severe sepsis, encephalopathy, and aspiration pneumonia. The tragedy of his death lies in the brutal mechanics of his physical collapse. Sepsis is the body's extreme, life-threatening response to an infection. In Conaway's case, his immune system had been completely decimated by years of severe drug abuse and malnutrition. When an infection took hold, his body had absolutely no natural defenses left to deploy. Instead of fighting the invading bacteria, his immune system turned on itself, triggering widespread inflammation that began shutting down his major organs one by one. His kidneys were failing. His liver was failing. The encephalopathy was a direct result of the toxic environment inside his bloodstream. It is a broad medical term for severe brain disease, damage, or malfunction. Decades of heavy narcotic and alcohol consumption, combined with the acute lack of oxygen he suffered while lying unconscious on the floor of his home, had severely damaged his neurological pathways. His brain tissue was essentially suffocating. But the most devastating and immediate cause of his impending death was the aspiration pneumonia. This is the grim, unglamorous reality of how severe opiate addicts actually die. It is a mechanical failure of the body's defensive reflexes. When a massive dose of opiates depresses the central nervous system, it paralyzes the gag reflex, the involuntary muscle contraction in the back of the throat that prevents foreign objects and fluids from entering the respiratory tract. Dr. Drew Pinsky, the addiction medicine specialist who had treated Conaway on reality television and witnessed his deterioration firsthand, later explained the brutal clinical mechanics of what had occurred in Conaway's home. Speaking to the press to combat the sensationalized rumors of a deliberate suicide, Dr. Pinsky delivered a sobering, deeply clinical assessment of the tragedy. Jeff was a severe opiate addict, Dr. Pinsky stated plainly. What happens is, like with most opiate addicts, eventually they take a little too much and they aspirate, so what's in their mouth gets into their lungs. That's what happened with Jeff. He had not intentionally swallowed a lethal dose of pills to end his life. He had simply taken his usual massive dosage to manage his agonizing physical pain. The opiates had dragged him into a state of profound sedation. While he was unconscious, his bodily fluids, saliva or stomach contents, had pooled in the back of his throat. Because his nervous system was too paralyzed by the painkillers to trigger a cough or a swallow, those fluids bypassed his esophagus and drained directly down his trachea, flooding into his lungs. He had essentially drowned in his own bed, suffocating slowly while completely unaware of his surroundings. The fluid in his lungs created the perfect, dark, warm environment for a massive bacterial infection to breed, resulting in the aspiration pneumonia that rapidly developed into systemic sepsis. It is an incredibly painful, undignified, and terrifyingly common way for chronic addicts to die. For 16 agonizing days, Jeff Conaway lay in the intensive care unit at Encino Hospital. The man who had once danced on the hood of a Ford Deluxe in front of millions of adoring cinema-goers was now entirely hidden beneath a tangle of intravenous lines, heart monitors, and the thick corrugated tubing of a mechanical ventilator. The rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the breathing machine was the only indication that he was still technically alive. Outside the hospital doors, the media maintained a constant vigil, hungry for the final update. But inside the room, there was only the quiet, crushing grief of his family. They stood by his bedside, watching the monitors chart the steady, irreversible decline of his vital signs. The medical team utilized every intervention available in modern critical care. They pumped him full of broad-spectrum intravenous antibiotics in a desperate attempt to combat the sepsis. They administered medications to support his failing blood pressure. They continuously adjusted the ventilator to force oxygen into his severely compromised lungs. But medicine has its absolute limits, and the damage inflicted upon Conaway's body was simply too extensive to reverse. The infection in his lungs was too aggressive. The systemic inflammation from the sepsis was destroying his internal organs at a rate that the machines could not outpace. His brain, starved of oxygen during the initial crisis at his home, showed absolutely no signs of regaining consciousness. He was trapped in a deep, unrecoverable neurological void. The doctors eventually had to have the most difficult, devastating conversation a medical professional can have with a family. They informed them that Jeff Conaway was not going to wake up. The machines were no longer keeping him alive. They were merely prolonging the biological process of his death. Faced with this inescapable clinical reality, his family was forced to make an agonizing decision. They had to weigh his complete lack of brain activity and terminal organ failure against the artificial life support, keeping his heart beating. Recognizing that there was zero hope of recovery and wanting to grant him a final measure of peace, they chose to end his suffering. On the morning of May 27, 2011, surrounded by his sisters, his nieces, and his nephews, the medical staff at Encino Hospital gently removed the breathing tube. They switched off the ventilator. They discontinued the life-prolonging medications. And they waited. Jeff Conaway passed away quietly later that day. He was 60 years old. The subsequent autopsy performed by the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office completely validated the clinical assessments of the ICU doctors and Dr. Pinsky. The official report cut through the tabloid gossip with clinical precision. It definitively ruled his death as an accident. The coroner determined that the primary causes of death were the major internal infections, the pneumonia, and the sepsis. The report explicitly noted that while prescription medications were present in his system, they were entirely consistent with his established medical history of chronic pain management. They did not find a lethal, acute overdose of a single drug. The coroner's findings confirmed the most tragic aspect of his passing. He did not want to die on that morning in May. He had not given up. He was simply trying to survive the physical agony of another day in a shattered body. But the cumulative receipt of his addiction had finally been presented. His death was the direct, inescapable result of complications arising from chronic long-term substance abuse. The drugs had weakened his immune system, destroyed his neurological reflexes, and left him completely defenseless against a common mechanical failure of his own throat. When the news of his death broke, the entertainment industry responded with standard sterile condolences. Networks ran nostalgic clips of Kennedy and Bobby Wheeler, offering a hollow outpouring of grief that starkly contrasted with the deafening silence of the preceding 30 years. Hollywood operates on the cold logic of a balance sheet. They didn't kill Jeff Conaway with malice, but with absolute apathy. 30 years earlier, they viewed his disease not as a human tragedy, but as a logistical inconvenience. They divided his dialogue, quietly erased him from casting lists, and allowed him to fade into obscurity, only turning the spotlight back on decades later when his suffering could be monetized for reality television ratings. Hollywood is an assembly line, not a hospital. When a piece of machinery breaks, it is not repaired. It is replaced. On screen, Bobby Wheeler was granted a triumphant exit to chase his Hollywood dream. Jeff Conaway was never given that chance. As we watch the effortless charisma he left behind, we are left with an uncomfortable reality. When the studio audience stops laughing and the cameras finally turn off, the true human cost of our entertainment remains entirely off script.